Arriving an hour early for the ceremony, Dorothy suddenly overheard a conversation between her fiancé and future mother-in-law. Shocked for a moment, she quickly came up with an interesting plan. "Hello, my dears. Put your things aside for a minute. I want to tell you a story that will help you see your loved ones in a new light. Write in the comments where you're watching from. We hope you enjoy listening." Dorothy adjusted the thin pearl necklace around her neck and glanced at her watch again. There was still an hour left before the signing. She had deliberately come earlier to calm her growing nerves and mentally prepare for this big step. 35 years old. Not 18, and she fully understood the seriousness of what was happening. Behind her was a failed 7-year romance with Richard, who had never found the courage to make it official, countless dates with men who either wanted casual flings or were simply looking for a housekeeper with benefits. And now, finally, 3 years ago, when she first saw Dan at a corporate event of their partner company, it never even crossed her mind that this smiling 40-year-old man with kind eyes and a touch of gray at his temples would one day become her fiancé. Their relationship hadn't rushed forward but unfolded calmly, the way it should at their age. At first business meetings, then dinners, weekends together, and finally, his proposal at the Plaza restaurant. The very same one where her parents had celebrated their wedding nearly 40 years ago. To Dorothy, that felt like a good sign. She absent-mindedly touched the wedding ring she had put on that morning, despite the superstition. But she wasn't superstitious, more practical. That very quality had helped her buy her own 3-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood and furnish it completely. It had taken 3 years of paying off a mortgage and giving up a lot, but now she had her own safe haven, her own fortress. City Hall greeted her with the cool air of the conditioner and that special quiet that exists only in official buildings early in the morning. At that Tuesday hour, it seemed as if even the air was filled with solemnity. Marble floors, columns, heavy doors, everything radiated formality and importance. Dorothy walked carefully across the polished floor, afraid of slipping in her brand-new stilettos. They pinched a little, as new shoes always do, but what bride isn't ready to endure that on her big day? She and Dan hadn't planned a lavish wedding. They weren't that young anymore, and the desire to put their personal lives on display had faded a decade ago. They decided to keep it simple, sign the papers with only their closest ones present, and then celebrate quietly at a restaurant. Just last week her friend Judith had offered to throw her a bachelorette party, but Dorothy had turned it down. What kind of bachelorette party at 35, she had joked. I can't even remember when I was a girl. But that wasn't the real reason. It was just that the pre-wedding fuss, though pleasant, was exhausting. She simply wanted to begin her new life with Dan as soon as possible. I should call him, she thought. Let him know I'm already here. Maybe he had come early too. Taking her phone out of the small elegant purse that perfectly matched her cream-colored suit, she saw a missed call from Judith and 3 congratulatory messages. Normally she would have answered right away, but today all her thoughts were on the ceremony ahead. She tapped on Dan's name to call, pressed the phone to her ear, and heard only, "The subscriber is temporarily unavailable." Strange. They had agreed to meet here exactly half an hour before the ceremony, and Dan was never late. Dorothy slowly walked down the hallway, looking at photos of happy couples on the walls. On one of them was a woman who looked strikingly like her mother in her youth, the same gentle features, the same shy smile. Her mother would have been so happy for her today. Too bad she had passed away 5 years ago and wouldn't see her daughter finally find family happiness. Turning the corner, Dorothy entered a small lounge with sofas and a coffee table scattered with glossy magazines. On one cover was a famous actress, a star of the classic films Dorothy used to watch every Sunday with her parents. Now that actress was advertising an anti-aging cream. Time flies, Dorothy thought with a trace of sadness, remembering those family evenings in front of their old TV. She moved on, hoping to find a staff member to clarify the details of the ceremony. The long corridor branched off, and she turned right, where from a half-open door marked bridal room voices could be heard. As she came closer, she immediately recognized Dan's velvet tone and the husky timbre of his mother Virginia, roughened by years of smoking. Dorothy was about to knock and enter. After all, she had every right to be in the bridal room, but froze when she heard her name spoken with unusual irritation. "Dan, I'm telling you for the last time," Virginia said firmly. "After the wedding, no more excuses. Dorothy's apartment goes up for sale, and you both move in with me. Enough stalling." Dorothy froze, hardly believing her ears. What sale? She had never even discussed selling her apartment with Dan. On the contrary, they had agreed he would move in with her after the wedding since her place was bigger and closer to the center. "Mom, I promised you, everything will be the way you want," Dan's voice answered, carrying a pleading note. "But maybe not right away. Dorothy is so proud of that apartment, she bought it herself, paid off the mortgage for years. And I raised you alone for 38 years, Virginia snapped, her tone sharp and commanding, the same way Dorothy had often heard her speak to Dan when they visited. "I worked 2 jobs so you'd have everything. Do you think it was easy for me after your father died? I spent nights sewing, taking on extra work so you could get into university. And now you're telling me not right away? Your Dorothy is young, full of energy, she can earn 10 more apartments. But how much time do I have left? At my age, people think about eternity, not careers. Don't I have the right to live in comfort in my old age, instead of this shabby flat with a broken-down elevator?" Her apartment is spacious, central, beautifully renovated. "We'll sell it. With the money, we'll expand the country house, add another room, glass in the veranda. We'll spend summers there, raise the grandkids in fresh air, feed them vegetables from the garden. Not let them chew on those burgers all the time." Dorothy froze on the spot, feeling a chill spread through her whole body. The blood drained from her face, and her head buzzed as if she were caught inside a snowstorm. With trembling fingers, she clutched the wall to keep from collapsing. Virginia's tone was exactly like Miss Claire's, the domineering neighbor who had once ruled over her weak-willed son, a man well into his 40s who still hadn't managed to build his own family. "Mom, I'll try to talk to her after the wedding." Dan's voice sounded uncertain, and Dorothy recognized that tone. It was the same way he answered whenever his mother insisted they come every weekend to help with chores. "No more I'll try," Virginia snapped, and Dorothy could almost feel her fiancé's will bending under the weight of his mother's demands. "Family is sacrifice. I sacrificed my whole life for you. I denied myself everything, didn't even buy dresses, just so you could have it all. Now it's your turn to take care of your mother. Or are you not a man? Will you spend your whole life leeching off women?" Her words dripped with venom, and Dorothy instinctively stepped back, as if afraid that poison might spill onto her too. She had never thought of Dan as weak. On the contrary, he had always shown care, decisiveness, and responsibility in their relationship. But now, listening to him with his mother, she saw another man altogether, hesitant, spineless, willing to betray the woman he loved just to keep his mother's approval. A long silence followed, and then Dan's voice came quietly, "All right, Mom. I'll do it. You're right, family is the most important thing. That's my boy." Virginia's voice instantly softened, almost tender. "I'm only doing this for you too. You'll thank me later. We'll live together, I'll keep the house in order, I'll cook borscht, watch the kids when they're born. After all, your Dorothy is such a career woman, she'll be gone at work day and night. Who's going to think about family then? But I'll always be here." Dorothy stepped back from the door, feeling something snap inside her. The floor seemed to disappear beneath her feet, the air suddenly thick, impossible to breathe. Her temples throbbed so loudly she feared they'd hear the pounding through the door. She turned and tiptoed away, careful not to let her heels click against the marble. Only after she turned the corner did she manage to take a breath. What was happening? Her thoughts tumbled over each other. Could it really be? Her mind flashed back to their first real date, when Dan had asked her so eagerly about her apartment, how she managed to buy it on her own, in such a good neighborhood. She had thought he admired her independence and determination. But now it seemed he had simply been appraising a future prize, like a realtor calculating property value. And what about their talks of the future? Of children growing up in that spacious apartment, of how they'd decorate the nursery together. All lies. Just a way to gain her trust and then strip her of her home. For what? To expand his mother's country house? Dorothy stepped outside and drew in a deep breath. The June morning was summer warm, but she shivered as if in winter. Slowly, she lowered herself onto a bench in front of City Hall, unaware that she was sitting right under the scorching sun. People passed by, young mothers with strollers, elderly couples, office clerks rushing to work, but Dorothy saw only blurry shapes. "Miss, are you all right?" A concerned elderly woman with a shopping mitt filled with bread and milk appeared before her. "You're as white as a sheet." "I'm fine, thank you." Dorothy tried to smile, but her lips wouldn't obey. "Drink some water," the woman offered a bottle of mineral water. "In this heat you'll faint without it. And you're dressed so elegantly too." Dorothy gratefully accepted, took a sip. The cool water cleared her head a little. "Thank you so much," she said, handing it back. The woman gave a satisfied nod and walked on. That small act of kindness steadied Dorothy. Suddenly she realized she was sitting outside City Hall in her wedding suit, about to marry a man who had just plotted with his mother to take away her apartment. Her phone vibrated. A message from Dan. "I'm on my way." "Everything okay? Are you there?" As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just discussed destroying her life behind her back. She might never have overheard. She might have gone through with the wedding, only to find herself homeless months later, because family is sacrifice. Dorothy stared blankly at the screen for a few seconds, then her lips pressed into a thin line. Well, now she knew the truth. She knew what really lay behind the pretty words of love and a shared future. 3 years together, and yet she didn't know him at all. Her first instinct was to call Judith, cancel the ceremony, end it all right now. But something stopped her. Maybe her natural restraint, maybe the need for certainty. Or maybe she wanted to test Dan, to see just how far he was willing to go. Her fingers typed quickly, "Yes, I'm here. Waiting for you." She hit send, then drew in a long breath and slowly exhaled. Inside her, a plan was forming. She would not marry a man willing to betray her trust. But before ending it, she wanted to see how far he would take it. Most importantly, she now had the chance to protect herself from his schemes. Dorothy stood up, squared her shoulders, and strode back into City Hall. Her face no longer showed confusion or pain. Only calm determination. Life had thrown her an unexpected lesson, and she would learn it well. She had invested too many years, too much effort into her apartment and her independence to let anyone strip it from her for the sake of her mother-in-law's country house. My God, she thought suddenly, I could have married him and never found out. The idea made her shudder. A coincidence had saved her from catastrophe, or maybe not coincidence at all. Maybe fate had stepped in to show her the truth before it was too late. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Dan, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Love you." Dorothy gave a bitter smile. Love? Soon she would see what that word really meant to him. Back inside City Hall, she went straight to the ladies' room. She needed to freshen up, but more than that, to gather her thoughts. She stared hard at her reflection. Her face was still pale, but the lost, panicked look was gone. In its place, a cold gleam of determination had taken root. Pull yourself together, she told herself. You're strong. You'll get through this. Dorothy pulled a tube of foundation from her purse and touched up her cheeks and lips. Then she combed her hair and pinned back a loose strand with a bobby pin. She remembered how her mother used to say, if you don't know what to do, fix your hair. While your hands are busy, your head starts working. That simple piece of wisdom had helped her through many difficult moments. Through the wall, she heard the sound of a car pulling up and men's voices. Most likely, Dan had arrived with his friend Rick, who was supposed to be his best man. She needed to act quickly. Dorothy took out her phone and called her best friend Judith. "Judith, hi, it's me," she said as soon as the call was answered. "Dorothy, where are you?" "I thought you were already at City Hall," Judith's voice sounded anxious. "I'm here, but listen, I need a big favor. Can you come half an hour earlier?" And bring a thermometer with you, please. A thermometer? Judith repeated in surprise. What, did you get sick today of all days? Not exactly, Dorothy lowered her voice, though the restroom was empty. To be precise, I'm about to get sick. Seriously, Judith, I need your help. I'll explain everything when you get here. There was a short pause, then Judith answered firmly, I'll be there in 15 minutes. And don't you dare get married without me. Dorothy smiled gratefully. That was real friendship, no unnecessary questions, just readiness to help. They had been friends since school, and Judith had never once let her down. Leaving the ladies' room, Dorothy ran into Dan. He looked worried, but his face lit up with a smile when he saw her. There you are. He stepped closer, ready to hug her, but Dorothy made a barely noticeable move back. Dan raised his eyebrows in surprise but decided it was just pre-wedding nerves. I tried calling you. Is everything okay? Yes, everything's fine. Dorothy forced herself to smile, though it felt stiff, like a mask on her face. Just a little nervous. Dan steadied her carefully. You look pale. Are you feeling sick? It was the perfect chance, and Dorothy took it. To be honest, I haven't felt great since this morning. Probably just nerves. She pressed her palm to her forehead. I think I might even have a fever. Maybe we should postpone? Dan's voice carried concern, but there was something else there too. Disappointment? Irritation? Before, Dorothy wouldn't have noticed those tones, but now, knowing the truth, she caught them instantly. No need, she quickly replied. I'll take a pill, and I'll be fine. I just need a little time. My mom always said I was too sensitive. Your mom was a wise woman. Dan finally hugged her, and Dorothy caught the familiar scent of his cologne. The very one she had given him for his birthday. Back then, it had felt so intimate, almost like family, choosing a fragrance for the man she loved. And now? Now it was the smell of betrayal. Yes, she was wise, Dorothy whispered, pulling away. Have you seen my friend at City Hall? Who? Dan didn't understand. My bridesmaid, Judith. You know we've been like sisters since childhood. Oh, no, she hasn't arrived yet. Dan glanced at his watch. She's always late. Remember my birthday? Dorothy nodded, remembering how Judith had indeed been late that day because she'd stopped at 3 different stores to find the exact cake Dan liked. She had spent half the day choosing a gift for him. All that effort for a man now plotting to strip her best friend of her home. You know, I think I'll go sit in the bridal room for a while, Dorothy said. Collect my thoughts. You don't mind, do you? Of course not, Dan kissed her cheek gently. I also want to check a few things before the ceremony. Call me if you need anything. When he left, Dorothy leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. For a moment, it felt like a bad dream that she would wake up in her own apartment and Dan would be there, caring, loving, reliable, the way she had believed him to be all these years. But reality was different, and the thought made her throat tighten. Her reflections were cut short by the sound of the door opening. Judith entered the hall, a petite, energetic woman with short hair and bright lipstick. Spotting her friend, she strode over, already pulling a thermometer out of her bag. I came as fast as I could, she said without preamble. So? What's going on? Do you really have a fever? Dorothy glanced around to make sure they were alone, then quickly spoke. Judith, you won't believe what I found out. Dan and his mother, they're planning to sell my apartment after the wedding and move in with her. Judith froze with the thermometer in her hand. What? Are you sure? I heard them myself. They didn't know I was already here. His mother said outright that my apartment has to be sold, and the money should go into expanding her country house. Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes, but she brushed them away firmly. 3 years together, Judith. 3 years. And all this time, they. That bastard, Judith hissed, her face twisting in anger. So what are you going to do? Cancel the wedding? Dorothy, surprising even herself, shook her head. Not right away. First, I need to be sure this isn't some kind of misunderstanding. What if I misheard? Judith snorted. What's there to misunderstand? We'll sell Dorothy's apartment sounds pretty clear to me. Yes, but Dorothy herself didn't know why she hesitated. Maybe she still hoped Dan would come to his senses. Or maybe she just couldn't accept that 3 years of her life had been wasted. I want to see how far he's willing to go. Do you understand? And how exactly are you going to do that? Judith crossed her arms. First, I'm going to get sick, Dorothy said, taking the thermometer from her. We'll postpone the ceremony for a week. In the meantime, I'll test his intentions. Dorothy, Judith gripped her shoulders and looked her in the eye. Are you sure? Wouldn't it be easier to just end it now? Why torture yourself? Dorothy hesitated. Why indeed? But deep down she knew the answer. She needed absolute certainty. She had invested too much time, too many hopes in this relationship to let it all collapse because of one overheard conversation. Even if that conversation turned everything upside down. I need to know for sure, she said firmly. Help me, Judith. I have to look sick. Judith sighed but didn't argue. She pulled a compact out of her bag and quickly dabbed pale green concealer onto her friend's face. Here, she handed over the thermometer. I'll warm it up with the hairdryer, and you just put on your suffering face. And don't overact, you're not on stage. Dorothy gave her a grateful smile. That was what she loved about Judith, her blunt honesty, her practicality, her readiness to back her even in the craziest schemes. Together, they could move mountains. Or at least expose one lying fiancé. 10 minutes later, Dorothy looked convincingly ill, pale, dark circles under her eyes, a sheen of sweat on her forehead, and most importantly, a thermometer reading a high fever. Call Dan, Judith commanded. And remember, don't overplay it. Dorothy dialed her fiancé. He picked up almost immediately. Yes, darling. Dan, Dorothy's voice came out weak and broken. I don't think I can do this today. I feel really awful. What happened? Dan's voice carried worry. I've got a high fever. Dorothy paused as if speaking cost her effort. Judith is here, she checked. I can barely stand. I'm coming right now, Dan said firmly. Where are you? In the bridal room. First floor, to the right of the main entrance. A minute later the door flew open, and Dan rushed in. Seeing Dorothy slumped on the couch with a thermometer in her hand and a pale face, he hurried over. God, you really don't look well, he said, sitting beside her and taking her hand. How long have you felt like this? Since morning I've felt a little shivery, but I thought it was just nerves. Dorothy closed her eyes, feigning weakness. Now my head's splitting, my whole body aches. Dan turned to Judith. What do we do? Should we call a doctor? I already called a cab, she answered. I'll take her home so she can rest. If it doesn't get better, we'll call a doctor. I'll take her myself, Dan objected. What about the guests? Dorothy asked faintly. They'll be arriving any minute. Dan froze, his face showing an inner struggle. He was clearly torn between caring for his fiancée and having to explain things to the guests, his mother among them. I'll call them and explain everything, he said at last. I'll tell them the ceremony is postponed until next week. Dorothy glanced at Judith, who gave the slightest nod. Step 1 was complete. The signing was postponed. Now she had time for the next stage of her plan. Dan, I'm so sorry, Dorothy squeezed his hand. I was so looking forward to this day. It's all right, he stroked her hair. Your health comes first. We'll get married when you feel better. Don't worry about it. Dorothy caught Judith's eyes again. The look said, see? He's not even that upset. And it was true, though Dan looked concerned, there was none of the frustration you might expect from a groom whose wedding had just been canceled at the last minute. I'll take you home, Dan repeated. Judith can call the guests and let them know. I'll stay with you. No, don't, Dorothy shook her head. You need to talk to the staff here and reschedule everything. And you should explain it to your mother in person. She's been looking forward to this day so much." At the mention of his mother, Dan's face tightened for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "You're right. I'll come by tonight then, okay? I'll bring medicine and something to eat." "Thank you," Dorothy gave him a faint smile. "You're so caring." Once Dan left, Judith shut the door firmly and turned to her friend. "You're unbelievable. I almost died laughing when you brought up his mother. Did you see how nervous he got?" Dorothy dropped the pained expression from her face. "I saw. And it only confirms my suspicions. But I still want to be 100% sure. So what now?" Judith sat beside her. "What's your plan?" Dorothy looked thoughtfully out the window. The sky outside was a clear June blue. Just as clear and cloudless as her future had seemed only an hour ago. "Now," she said slowly, "now I'm going to pay a visit to my almost mother-in-law." Judith whistled. "That's risky. What if she figures it out?" "She won't," Dorothy stood up with determination. "I'll play the role of the caring fiancé who wants to get closer to her future mother-in-law. I'll find out what she really thinks about our marriage, about the future, about my apartment. And what will you tell Dan?" "That I felt better and decided to cheer up his mother. After all, she must be so upset about the wedding being postponed," Dorothy said with irony. "Dan will be thrilled to see us getting along. It's what he's always wanted." Judith shook her head. "I don't know, Dorothy. I don't like this. Can't you just break up with him and be done with it?" Suddenly Dorothy felt a surge of anger, not only at Dan and his mother, but at herself. For being blind, for believing the sweet words, for letting herself open up to someone unworthy of her trust. "No, I can't," she said firmly. "I want the truth. All of it. And then I'll decide what to do." Judith studied her carefully and seemed to understand there was no point in arguing. "All right," she sighed. "I'm with you. What do you want me to do?" Dorothy squeezed her hand gratefully. "Now we go to my place. I need to keep looking sick when Dan comes by tonight. And tomorrow I'll visit Virginia." As she stepped out of City Hall, Dorothy cast one last look at the place where the wedding ceremony was supposed to take place. Just that morning, she had pictured herself standing there beside the man she loved, exchanging rings, beginning their new life together. Now those dreams had collapsed like a house of cards at the slightest breeze. But instead of sadness, she felt only determination. Life went on, and now she would be the one setting the rules of the game. The next morning was overcast. Dorothy stood at the window of her apartment, staring thoughtfully at the gray sky. The evening before had gone exactly as planned. Dan had shown up with a bag of medicine, a thermometer, and containers of chicken broth he swore he'd cooked himself. Dorothy had played the part of the weak, grateful bride, all the while secretly observing him. Was there anything in his behavior that hinted at a double game? Perhaps only one detail. Several times, he casually mentioned how upset his mother was about the canceled wedding. Mom was really looking forward to it, he had said, adjusting Dorothy's pillow. She even bought a new dress. Dorothy had barely stopped herself from asking if Virginia had also planned to celebrate a housewarming. Instead, she nodded sympathetically and promised that as soon as she felt better, they would reschedule immediately. Now, standing by the window, she was mentally preparing for her visit to her would-be mother-in-law. Virginia lived in an old apartment on the outskirts of the city, the very neighborhood where Dorothy herself had grown up. How many times had she gone there with Dan for Sunday lunches? Each time, Virginia greeted them with forced cheerfulness, served pies, poured herself a little brandy to stimulate the appetite. And all the while, as it turned out, she had been making plans to seize her future daughter-in-law's apartment. A phone call broke her thoughts. It was Judith. "So, how are you?" Ready for the visit to that Judith hesitated, searching for a polite word to describe the almost mother-in-law. "Ready," Dorothy said firmly. "I already have my story. I'll say I'm feeling better and came to apologize in person for yesterday's fiasco." Does Dan know you're going to see Mommy Dearest? I texted him. Dorothy glanced at her phone. He was delighted. Said he had an important meeting with a client today, so he was glad I'd have company. Of course he was, Judith snorted. His plans moving along smoothly. Are you sure you can keep a straight face and not tell that woman exactly what you think of her? Dorothy smiled. Don't worry. I'll be all charm. Virginia won't suspect a thing. All right, Judith said, though doubt still lingered in her tone. Call me if anything goes wrong. I'll be waiting. Dorothy hung up and checked her purse once more. Phone with recorder, spare battery, a box of chocolates for Virginia, and most important, calm and resolve. The trip to Virginia's place took almost an hour. Dorothy stepped out of the taxi and stopped in front of a 5-story building from the 1960s. The entrance paint was peeling, and by the doorway stood 2 elderly women chatting animatedly. When they noticed Dorothy, they fell silent, staring at her with curiosity. Hello, Dorothy greeted them politely. Hello, dear, replied one of them, Mrs. Clare, Virginia's neighbor. Going to see Virginia? She's home. I saw her come back with shopping bags. Must have been at the market. Dorothy nodded and headed inside. Climbing to the 3rd floor, she took a deep breath before ringing the bell. Footsteps sounded, and a moment later, Virginia appeared. A small, wiry woman with dyed red hair and sharp, watchful eyes. Dorothy, she exclaimed in surprise. What are you doing here? Dan said you were sick. Hello, Virginia, Dorothy forced a smile. I'm feeling better, and I wanted to come by to apologize in person for yesterday. I know you were so looking forward to the wedding. Virginia's face softened, though suspicion still lingered in her eyes. Come in, don't stand on the doorstep, she said, stepping aside. I just put the kettle on. Virginia's small 2-room apartment breathed of the past. A glass cabinet with crystal dishes, an old rug, a worn sofa draped with a lace cover. On the coffee table lay a stack of old magazines Virginia had apparently been saving since the 1980s. Come into the kitchen, she instructed. I baked a vegetable pie. Dan loves those. Dorothy followed her into the tiny kitchen, barely big enough for a table and 2 chairs. Cups and a little bowl of jam were already set out. Dorothy discreetly switched on the recorder on her phone and slipped it into her pocket. So, you're all better already? Virginia asked, pouring the tea. Dan said you had a high fever. Not completely, Dorothy gave a small cough. But much better. I couldn't just sit at home, I thought I'd come and see you. Virginia nodded approvingly. Good. A wife should look after her mother-in-law. Mine was strict, always checking everything around the house, sticking her nose everywhere. But I never held it against her, I understood that family is sacred. Dorothy sipped her tea, gathering her thoughts. How best to steer the conversation? Virginia, she began carefully, I was just thinking. After the wedding, Dan and I plan to live at my place. Won't you be lonely here by yourself? Virginia froze with her cup halfway to her lips, her eyes narrowing. Why? Did Dan say something? No, Dorothy answered quickly. I'm just worried. You're so used to having your son nearby. Virginia set her cup down and studied Dorothy closely. You know, dear, she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost gentle, a mother always comes first for her son. I raised Dan on my own, without a father. Went sleepless nights so he could have everything. And he remembers that. He values it. Dorothy felt anger boiling inside but kept her expression politely interested. Of course, Virginia. Dan loves you very much. You know, Virginia leaned in as if sharing a secret, I've always had a dream. To live in a big apartment with a balcony, where I could grow flowers. And with a room for the grandchildren. Once you and Dan get married and give me grandkids, we'll all live together. Dorothy nearly choked on her tea. There it was. Virginia herself had brought up living together, without even trying to hide it. All together? Dorothy asked lightly. But my apartment isn't that big. Only 2 bedrooms. 3, Virginia corrected. You said yourself it was a 3-room apartment. Dorothy made a mental note. Her mother-in-law-to-be remembered the layout of her apartment perfectly, even though she had only been there twice. Yes, but one of the rooms is my office. I sometimes work from home. An office, Virginia scoffed. What a luxury. Back in my day, we used the kitchen table for everything: eating, doing homework, ironing clothes. And we still turned out fine. Dorothy took another sip of tea, trying to calm herself. She needed to keep the conversation going, dig out more details. What if she paused, as though thinking aloud? What if Dan and I sold my apartment, and you sold yours, and we bought one big place together? That way you wouldn't be alone, and financially it would be easier for us too. Virginia's eyes lit up, but she quickly masked her reaction. Oh, I don't know, dear. I'm used to my apartment. Every corner holds a memory. Dan took his first steps right here, and over there was his crib. Dorothy could barely stop herself from smiling. Of course, Virginia didn't want to sell her apartment. Her plan was for a one-way deal. I understand, Dorothy nodded sympathetically. It's hard to part with a place full of memories. I'm very attached to mine too. I put so much into it, picked out every tile in the bathroom myself. Virginia's tone suddenly sharpened. Well, that's different. You're young, you have your whole life ahead of you. You'll buy 10 more apartments. But me? I don't have much time left. Dorothy noticed how quickly Virginia switched to self-pity, a tactic she had seen her use often with Dan. Oh, don't say that, Virginia, Dorothy exclaimed with feigned concern. You'll outlive us all. You're so full of energy. Oh, child, Virginia sighed heavily. You don't know the half of my ailments. The doctors say I need to live in better conditions, with proper conveniences. And what do I have? An old bathtub, a cramped toilet, freezing rooms in the winter. Dorothy silently applauded Virginia's acting. She really was skilled at steering the conversation where she wanted it to go. Maybe a renovation would help? Dorothy suggested. Dan and I could pitch in. What's the point of renovating? Virginia waved her hand. This building is falling apart, the pipes are terrible. No, the only real solution is to move. To a new neighborhood, a modern apartment. With an elevator, with proper facilities. Dorothy decided to risk a direct question. Virginia, have you thought maybe we could all live together in my apartment? There's enough space, and the location is good. Virginia froze for a moment, then her face lit up with a smile. Oh, Dorothy, that's exactly what I've been thinking lately. She grabbed Dorothy's hand and squeezed it tight. Living together is the right thing. Family should be together. I'll cook, I'll take care of the house while you're at work. And later, when the grandkids come, who's going to watch them? Nannies are too expensive these days, but Grandma will always be here. Dorothy could barely keep her face composed. So that was the plan. First move in, then surely persuade her to sell. She wondered, had Dan known from the start, or had his mother slowly pulled him into this scheme? And what does Dan think? Dorothy asked casually. Is he okay with living together? Virginia's eyes narrowed slyly. Of course. My son's a good boy, he'd never abandon his mother. He's the one who suggested I move in with you too. Said, Mom, why should you struggle alone? We'll live together and take care of each other. Dorothy felt a lump rise in her throat. So Dan had suggested it himself. Not reluctantly agreed under pressure, but actually initiated it. That was even more painful than she had imagined. He's very caring, she managed to say. The best, Virginia confirmed proudly. You know, Dorothy, at first I worried when he said he was getting married. I thought, that's it, some floozy will steal him away, and he'll forget his mother. But then I met you and realized, you're a good girl. You understand family values. Dorothy nearly laughed out loud at the irony. Virginia's family values clearly meant blind obedience to her will and handing over the apartment. Thank you, Virginia, Dorothy said, forcing her smile to look sincere. Your approval means a lot to me. Well, good then, Virginia nodded with satisfaction. That's settled. After the wedding, I'll move in with you. Later, maybe we'll sell my place too. It's old, won't fetch much, but enough to expand the country house. We'll spend summers there, all together in nature. Dan loves picking mushrooms, how about you? Do you like mushrooms? Dorothy shook her head. Not really. I'm afraid of choosing a poisonous one. You'll learn. Virginia declared firmly. I'll teach you everything. And my pickled cucumbers? To die for. Dorothy glanced at her watch. Time to end the charade. She had gotten everything she needed, clear confirmation of Virginia's plans to move in and eventually sell her apartment. Virginia, I'd better go, she said, standing. I promised Dan I wouldn't stay long. I'm still not fully recovered. Of course, Virginia fussed. Go rest. Get well soon, or we'll have to postpone the wedding again. Let me wrap some pie for you, give it to Dan. As Dorothy stood at the door, Virginia suddenly asked, Have you thought about renting out your apartment once you move in with me? Dorothy froze. With you? But you said you'd move in with us. Virginia waved her hands quickly. Oh, what am I saying? Of course, with you. My tongue slips sometimes. I'm getting old, my memory's not what it used to be. Dorothy stepped out of the building with the pie in hand and drew a deep breath of fresh air. Now she had no doubts. The plan was crystal clear, first the wedding, then living with Dan's mother, and finally the sale of her apartment. And Dan knew all about it, in fact, he'd been the one to suggest it. That evening, when Dan came over to check on her, Dorothy was ready. She warmed up Virginia's pie, brewed tea, and prepared herself for Act 3 of her performance. Dan showed up around 7 in the evening with a bouquet of chrysanthemums and a box of chocolates, the very same ones Dorothy had loved since childhood. Once, such gestures would have touched her deeply. Now they only made her smile bitterly. How genuine was this? Just another mask, or simply a habit he hadn't managed to break yet? How are you feeling? Dan kissed her cheek and looked her over carefully. You look better already. No fever? It's lower now, but still there, Dorothy lied, pointing at the thermometer she had thoughtfully heated with a hairdryer before his arrival. But I feel much better. I even managed to visit your mom. Dan's face tightened for a split second, then he quickly smiled. Yes, she called me, told me all about it. She was so happy to see you. And she sent pie, I see. Yes, it's delicious, Dorothy gestured toward the plate with pie. Your mother is an amazing homemaker. You can tell she's spent her whole life caring for her family. Dan nodded proudly, not catching the faint irony in her words. My mom is a treasure. Do you know how she raised me all on her own? After Dad died, she was only 32, and I was 10. But she never once complained. She did everything for me. Dorothy noted how often lately Dan circled back to his mother's sacrifices. He hadn't used to dwell on that so much. Clearly, Virginia had turned up the pressure before the wedding. She loves you very much. Dorothy sat down on the couch and gestured for Dan to join her. You know, we talked about the future today. About how things will be after the wedding. Dan froze, teacup halfway to his lips. Oh? And what did you talk about? Dorothy watched his reaction carefully. She said she feels lonely in her apartment. That she dreams of a big place with a balcony for flowers. I thought maybe we could all live together in my apartment. It's spacious enough. Dan's face lit up, and with visible relief, he leaned back against the couch. Really? Are you serious? Dorothy, that would be perfect. Mom has been dreaming of being closer to us. And when we have kids, she'll be there to help. Dorothy smiled, though inside everything twisted in pain. There it was with confirmation. Not a shadow of doubt, not a hint of regret. He wasn't even trying to hide how pleased he was that the plan was coming together. And what about her apartment? Dorothy asked casually. She doesn't plan to sell it, does she? Well, Dan hesitated. Mom thinks maybe someday we could sell her place and put the money into the country house. Add an extension, get proper plumbing. You know how she loves her garden. Dorothy nodded, as if the idea made perfect sense. And what about my apartment? We're not planning to sell that, right? Dan avoided her gaze, taking a sip of tea before answering. Well, maybe in the future. Once we have kids, we might want to move to a quieter area, closer to nature. Or even out of town. The city center isn't the best place for children, too noisy, too polluted. Dorothy felt rage rising inside her but forced herself to stay calm. So you're saying you'd consider selling my apartment? Our apartment, Dan corrected gently. After the wedding, everything will be ours. Yours and mine. But your mom's place would also count, right? Since she'll be adding money from selling hers, Dorothy asked, her tone deliberately innocent. Dan choked a little on his tea. Well, that's not exactly. Her money would go into the country house, which he trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. Which would also belong to all three of us. Dorothy prompted. Our apartment for 3, and the country house for 3? Yes, something like that, Dan admitted uncertainly. Dorothy tried another angle. Have you thought maybe it would be better for us to live separately from parents? We're adults. We should build our own family. Dan's expression changed instantly. His brows knit together, and his eyes took on the same look she had heard in his voice when he spoke with his mother. Dorothy, my mom gave her whole life for me. Now it's my turn to take care of her. She's alone, it's hard for her. Can't you spare a little space? You said you love me, and loving someone means accepting their family too. Dorothy barely kept from laughing at the bitter irony. Classic guilt-tripping, a tactic he had clearly learned from Virginia. Of course, I love you, she said softly, taking his hand. And I understand how important your mom is to you. I was just thinking, what if we sold both my apartment and hers, and bought a big house out of town? Plenty of space for everyone, and the kids could grow up in the fresh air. It was a test. Dorothy knew perfectly well her apartment in the city center was worth twice, maybe 3 times, as much as Virginia's old flat. Selling both would mean her contribution outweighed everything. Dan paused, clearly doing the math in his head. That's an interesting idea. But you know, it's not the best time to sell property right now. Prices are down. Maybe later, when the market picks up. Dorothy nodded, though she knew very well prices had been rising for 6 months straight. You're right. Let's get married first. Then we'll think about such serious decisions. Dan visibly relaxed. Good. The important thing is, you don't mind Mom living with us. I was afraid you'd object. A lot of women don't want to live with their mother-in-law. Dorothy smiled, thinking how far off he was from her real thoughts. I'm not like most women. I just want you to be happy. Dan leaned in and kissed her. I already am. I'll have a wonderful wife and everything I've ever dreamed of. Yes, Dorothy thought, you'll have everything you ever dreamed of. Only it looks like I'm not part of those dreams. After Dan left, Dorothy sat for a long time on the couch, staring out the window. Darkness was falling. Across the street, one by one, lights flickered on in the windows. People coming home from work, cooking dinner, going about their lives. Ordinary life, the same life that only a few days ago had seemed so clear and predictable to her. She pulled out her phone and called Judith. Hey, it's me. Are you busy? Never for you, her friend replied. So? Tell me, how did it go with the groom? It's all confirmed, Dorothy sank back against the couch. He knows everything about his mother's plans. More than that, he's clearly counting on us selling my apartment after the wedding and pouring the money into their family projects. The bastard, Judith's voice rang with genuine outrage. So what are you going to do now? Dorothy paused, gathering her thoughts. I haven't decided yet. But you know what hurts most? Not that he wanted my apartment, but that these 3 years together were fake. He pretended to love me all along, when really he was just following his mother's scheme to grab property. Are you sure? Judith's tone softened. Maybe he really does love you, he's just too tied to his mother? Dorothy thought about it. Maybe Judith was right? Maybe Dan had feelings for her but just couldn't stand up to his mother? The thought brought a brief flicker of comfort, quickly replaced by bitterness. What difference did it make if he loved her, if he was ready to betray her for his mother's approval? Even if that's true, she finally said, it doesn't change anything. I can't be with a man who puts his mother's wishes above mine, who would throw me out of my own home just to what? Enlarge his mother's country house? You're right, Judith sighed. He won't change. Men like that always stay under their mother's heel. So, you'll call off the wedding? Yes, Dorothy said firmly. But not right away. First, I want to test something. Another test? Judith sounded worried. Dorothy, haven't you had enough? You already know the truth. What more do you need? Dorothy's gaze fell on the photo on her dresser, her and Dan by the sea, smiling, happy. Back then, she really had been happy. And he had looked like he was too. I want to give him a chance, she whispered. One last chance to choose between me and his mother. If he truly loves me, he'll choose me. And if he doesn't? Judith asked. Then I'll know for sure I was right to end it. After hanging up, Dorothy got to work. She needed to prepare for the final act of this drama. She opened her laptop and began writing a list. At the very top, organize a dinner for Dan and his mother. The next day, she called Dan and said she was feeling much better, and she wanted to host a small dinner for him in Virginia. Since the wedding's been postponed, she told him, let's at least celebrate our decision to live together as one family. That's an important step too. Dan was thrilled. He had no idea Dorothy wasn't planning a festive evening, but a decisive conversation, one that would either end their relationship for good or, though she hardly believed it, give it one last chance. That evening, Dorothy went to the supermarket. She decided to cook all of Dan's and Virginia's favorites, beef stew with vegetables, a special family salad recipe from her grandmother, and a chocolate cake for dessert. Passing through the wine section, she stopped at the champagne shelf. A memory flashed, her and Dan's first Christmas together. They had bought a cheap bottle of champagne back then, not because they couldn't afford better, but out of childhood nostalgia. They had drunk it from crystal glasses Dorothy had inherited from her mother, dreaming about the future, about spending every Christmas together, about growing old side by side. Dorothy picked up the exact same bottle and put it in her basket. Let this evening be symbolic in every way, in the food, in the conversation, and in the farewell. Because most likely, this would be a farewell dinner. Back home, she started cooking. Her hands moved on autopilot while her thoughts wandered. She thought about how different things might have been if she hadn't arrived at the city hall an hour early, if she hadn't overheard that conversation. She would have married him, lived in the illusion of happiness, until one day Dan announced, "We're selling your apartment." No, she thought firmly, slicing vegetables for the salad. Better a bit of truth now than a shattered life later. Around 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Dorothy took one last look at the set table, checked her phone to make sure the recorder was running, and went to answer the door. Dan and Virginia stood there, both dressed up, holding flowers and a box of chocolates. "Come in," Dorothy smiled, letting them inside. "Dinner's almost ready." Virginia looked around the hallway with unconcealed interest, as if already measuring which pieces of furniture would need to go once she moved in. "You keep everything so spotless, Dorothy," she said with exaggerated admiration. "Such a homemaker. At my age, I can't keep up with housework anymore. My back, my legs." Dorothy smirked inwardly but only replied, "Thank you, Virginia. Please, go to the living room. I'll bring dinner in a moment." The evening began pleasantly enough. Virginia showered her with compliments on her cooking, though her tone carried a hint of condescension, not bad for a modern woman, but nowhere near my level. Dan was lively, talking about work, summer plans, how wonderful it would be for all of them to spend time at the country house. Just imagine, Dorothy, Virginia said, helping herself to a second serving of salad. The air there is like a health resort. My neighbor goes every year to fix her blood pressure. Says it's better than any medicine. Dorothy smiled and kept the conversation flowing, waiting for the right moment. She had saved the cake and champagne for the finale, when the atmosphere would be looser and more trusting. Finally, after the main dishes were finished, Dorothy stood and announced solemnly, "And now for dessert and champagne. Tonight is a celebration." She brought out the cake and the bottle of champagne. Dan's face lit up as soon as he saw it. "Do you remember our first Christmas? We had this same champagne." "I remember," Dorothy smiled as she poured the sparkling wine into glasses. "That's exactly why I bought it. For a special occasion." "What special occasion?" Virginia asked sharply. "Dorothy, are you hiding something from us?" Dorothy raised her glass. "Let's drink to honesty. To always telling each other the truth, no matter how bitter it might be." Dan and his mother exchanged quick glances but still raised their glasses. After they each took a sip of champagne, Dorothy said calmly, "I know about your plans." The room froze in heavy silence. Virginia stopped mid-bite, fork in hand, and Dan swallowed nervously. "What plans are you talking about?" he asked. Dorothy looked him straight in the eye. "About the plans to sell my apartment after the wedding and use the money to expand your mother's country house." Dan's face went pale, while Virginia suddenly laughed. "What nonsense are you talking about, girl? Who told you that?" Dorothy quietly pulled out her phone and pressed play. From the speaker came Virginia's voice, "After the wedding, no excuses. We'll sell Dorothy's apartment, and you'll move in with me." Virginia slammed her glass down, spilling champagne. "You were eavesdropping on us?" "No," Dorothy shook her head. "I overheard you by accident at City Hall. I came early and passed by the bridal room where you and Dan were discussing your plans." Dan grabbed his head. "Dorothy, you misunderstood everything." "Really?" She pressed play again. This time it was the recording from their recent conversation, Virginia's voice saying, "And maybe later we'll sell my apartment too. It's old anyway, won't fetch much. But it'll be enough to expand the country house." Virginia jumped up. "You recorded our talk? How dare you?" "I needed to be sure," Dorothy replied calmly. "To know for certain I wasn't imagining things." Dan looked completely lost. "Dorothy, listen." She raised her hand to stop him. "No, you listen. 3 years, Dan. For 3 years I believed you loved me, that we were building a future together. And all this time, you were just carrying out your mother's plan to take my apartment." "That's not true," Dan burst out. "I really do love you." "Then why did you agree to it?" Dorothy's eyes locked on his. "Why didn't you tell your mother that my apartment wasn't up for sale? That you wouldn't allow it?" Dan spread his hands helplessly. "You don't understand, Mom did so much for me. I couldn't say no to her." "But you could say no to me?" Dorothy asked quietly. "You could take away my home for the sake of your mother's house?" Seeing her son falter, Virginia cut in sharply. "Enough of this circus. Yes, we had those plans, so what? Family means sacrifice. Everyone gives something up for the greater good. And my apartment was supposed to be that sacrifice?" Dorothy turned to her. "What exactly were you sacrificing, Virginia? Your old apartment no one was going to live in anyway?" "Don't you dare speak to my mother like that," Dan snapped suddenly, and Dorothy realized she had her answer. In the crucial moment, he stood with his mother, not her. "Sorry," she said evenly. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I just want to understand why you thought you had the right to decide the fate of my apartment without me. Why you never discussed it with me?" "I was going to," Dan said uncertainly. "After the wedding. After it was too late for me to refuse," Dorothy finished for him. "When I'd already be your wife, forced to agree so I wouldn't break the family apart." Virginia scoffed. What melodrama? It's just an apartment. You're young, you'll earn enough to buy 10 more. It's not about the apartment, Virginia, Dorothy turned back to her. It's about trust. About respect. About love, for that matter. How can you build a family on lies? You can and you must, Virginia shot back. You think I told Dan's father everything? Hardly. A man only needs to know what's useful to him. Dorothy looked at Dan with sorrow. And you agree with that? You think it's fine to lie in a family? Dan stayed silent. That silence spoke louder than words. I see, Dorothy said softly, slipping off the engagement ring she'd worn since the proposal. I don't think we should get married. We see life too differently. Dorothy, don't overreact. Dan tried to grab her hand, but she pulled away. Let's just talk calmly. We can find a compromise. What kind of compromise, Dan? She asked wearily. Sell only half my apartment? A third? Or maybe let your mother run my household? Virginia shot to her feet. Enough. I won't listen to this. Dan, we're leaving. To Dorothy's surprise, Dan didn't move. Wait, Mom. I need to talk to Dorothy. Virginia curled her lips in disdain. What's there to talk about? She's made up her mind. Thinks we're swindlers. We only wanted to be one family, live together. At my expense, Dorothy said quietly. Virginia snatched her purse, fuming. I'll wait downstairs. Don't be long. When the door slammed behind her, the apartment fell into heavy silence. Dan sat with his head lowered, Dorothy watching him, waiting. You're really going to leave me over this? He finally asked. Dorothy gave a bitter smile. Over this? You call betrayal this? Dan, you dated me for 3 years, proposed, planned a wedding, and all that time you were plotting with your mother about my apartment. Tell me, how am I supposed to trust you after that? Dan lifted his eyes to her. I really do love you, Dorothy. But I love my mother too. She's done so much for me. I know, she said gently. She raised you alone, worked 2 jobs, sacrificed everything. You've told me 1,000 times. But Dan, that doesn't give her the right to control your life. Or mine. I get that, he muttered, rubbing his face. But what was I supposed to do? Leave her alone in that old flat? You could have been honest with me, Dorothy replied. You could have asked my opinion. You could have offered something fair, like investing the money from her apartment into our shared home. But instead, you two just planned to use me. Dan stayed silent, and that silence was answer enough. I think you should go now, Dorothy said quietly. Your mother's waiting. He stood up but still lingered at the door. Dorothy, maybe we could still try? I'll talk to Mom, explain that we won't sell your apartment. No, Dan. She shook her head. It's not about the apartment. It's about you. About the fact that you couldn't choose between me and your mother. And you never will. I don't want to spend my life fighting for a place in your heart. Dan lowered his head. I understand. Forgive me, if you can. When the door closed behind him, Dorothy slowly sank onto the couch. Strangely, she felt no pain, no disappointment, only relief. As if a heavy weight had slipped off her shoulders. She picked up her phone and called Judith. It's over, she said when her friend answered. I found out everything and broke up with him. How are you? Judith's voice was full of concern. Strangely enough good, Dorothy admitted. As if I've recovered from a long illness. Want me to come over? We could sit and talk. No, thanks. Dorothy smiled. I need to be alone. To process it all. After the call, she walked around her apartment, as if rediscovering every corner. Here in the living room, she and Dan often watched movies under one blanket. In the kitchen, they cooked Sunday breakfasts together. In the bedroom, Dorothy firmly opened the closet and pulled out a big box. Time to pack up all of Dan's things. He could pick them up when he was ready. Methodically folding his sweater, razor, the book he never finished, Dorothy thought about how easily years of building something could collapse. Just one overheard conversation, and the life that had seemed so clear and predictable was turned upside down. But maybe it was for the best. Maybe she was lucky to find out before the wedding, when it would have been so much harder to change everything. At the bottom of the dresser drawer, she found a photo. She and Dan in the park, laughing, holding hands. Dorothy looked at it for a long moment, then firmly placed it in the box. The past belonged in the past. When she finished packing, she made herself a cup of tea and stepped onto the balcony. The June evening was warm and quiet. Someone played guitar in the neighboring yard, a dog barked in the distance, and the sound of a TV drifted from an open window. Ordinary life, moving on, undisturbed by a single broken dream. Dorothy suddenly remembered how her grandmother once told her, "Remember, darling, free cheese only comes in a mousetrap." Back then, she hadn't understood. Now the meaning was crystal clear. Dan, with all his care, affection, and pretty words about love, was the free cheese. The trap was his dependence on his mother and the scheme with her apartment. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dan, "I still hope you'll change your mind. I really do love you." Dorothy stared at the words for a long time, then deleted the message. Maybe he had loved her in his own way. But it wasn't enough, not enough to resist his mother's influence, not enough to be honest, not enough to choose her. The next day, getting ready for work, Dorothy realized she felt truly free for the first time in years. No need to call anyone, to align plans, to adjust herself to someone else. The feeling was new and a little frightening, but also invigorating. At the office, her colleagues noticed a change right away. Dorothy had always been reserved, but today there was a new sharpness in her, almost a boldness. "Something happened?" asked Jill from her department. "You seem different today." Dorothy smiled. "I just realized something important. About myself. About life." Jill nodded knowingly, asking no further questions. At their age, every woman had her secrets and her revelations. That evening, on her way home, Dorothy bought herself a bouquet of fresh flowers. Just because. She placed them in a vase and looked around her apartment. It was once again her space, her fortress. And she wasn't going to let in anyone who didn't respect her boundaries or her right to live her own life. "Thank you for arriving an hour early," she thought to herself, recalling that day at City Hall when it had all begun. A coincidence that had saved her from a huge mistake. Or maybe not a coincidence at all, maybe fate. Either way, now she knew for certain, whatever the future brought, she'd handle it. Because she'd learned the most important lesson, to value herself and never let anyone else decide how she should live. A week passed after the breakup with Dan. Dorothy threw herself into work, filling every minute so there was no space for melancholy. Her colleagues noticed her relentless pace, but no one asked. Everyone knew the wedding had been called off, and politely avoided the subject. On Friday evening, as Dorothy was about to leave, her boss Kathy stopped her. Kathy, a sharp-eyed woman of 55 with a reputation for being strict but fair, beckoned her into her office. "Dorothy, stay a minute," she said, motioning to a chair. "Tea? Coffee?" "No, thank you." Dorothy tensed, expecting a work issue, maybe something wrong in her last report. But Kathy spoke of something else. "Dorothy, I don't like prying, but I can't help noticing you've changed. You've been overworking, staying late. Is it because of the canceled wedding?" Dorothy sighed. She disliked sharing personal matters at work, but Kathy had always treated her with a special kind of care, almost motherly. "Yes, Dan and I broke up," she answered simply. "Sorry if I'm out of line, but are you sure you did the right thing?" Kathy asked gently. "Whenever you spoke about him, your eyes used to shine." Dorothy gave a wry smile. "Yes, I was in love. But I realized I loved an image I created, not the real man." "I see." Kathy nodded. "Something similar happened to me. When I was young, I almost married someone who, as it turned out, only wanted my grandmother's 3-bedroom apartment. Dorothy's eyes widened. Really? What did you do? The same as you. I broke it off. Kathy smiled. And it was the best decision of my life. A year later, I met my husband. We've been together 30 years now. 30 years, Dorothy repeated thoughtfully. That's such a long time. And so short, Kathy corrected softly. When you're with the right person, time flies without you noticing. Dorothy felt a lump rising in her throat. She had dreamed of that kind of relationship too, long, steady, built on mutual respect. She hesitated, searching for words. I'm 35. Sometimes it feels like I've missed my chance. Kathy laughed. 35? You're still a kid. My friend got married for the first time at 48. And what a man she landed, everyone's jealous. Don't you dare bury yourself before your time. The conversation unexpectedly lifted Dorothy's spirits. She suddenly realized she really had been acting as if life were over. But in truth, everything was just beginning, a new chapter without lies and manipulation. Thank you, she said sincerely. I needed to hear that. You're welcome. Kathy stood, signaling the talk was over. And one more thing, Dorothy, come to the meeting Monday. I want to put you on a new project. Big, interesting. I think it'll do you good to dive into something worthwhile. Not like now, hiding from problems, but really engaging with something that matters. Dorothy nodded gratefully and left the office with a lighter heart. For the first time all week, she felt that life was moving forward, and there was still plenty of good ahead. She decided to spend the weekend actively. On Saturday, she went to a modern art exhibition she'd long wanted to see but always postponed. Dan had never liked that sort of thing, preferring weekends at home or at his mother's country house. On Sunday, she met Judith, and together they drove out to the lake. Swimming, sunbathing, grilling barbecue. How are you really? Judith asked once they settled on the shore. Truly okay, or just putting on a brave face? Dorothy thought for a moment. Was she really better, or had she just learned to hide the pain? You know, she finally said, I really am better. The first days were tough, 3 years is a long time. But now I feel relief. Like I dropped a heavy backpack I'd been carrying. Judith nodded knowingly. I figured as much. Lately you seemed closed off, almost. Always watching Dan, his opinions, his plans. But now you're like the Dorothy I knew before him. Really? Dorothy asked, surprised. I didn't realize I'd changed that much. Oh, you did, Judith said firmly. Remember how we used to go on hikes? Kayaking trips? Then Dan said it was dangerous, not something a woman should be doing, and you gave it all up. Dorothy frowned. It was true, they used to travel a lot, loved the outdoors. But after meeting Dan, all that faded. He preferred quiet pastimes, and slowly she had adopted his way of life, without even noticing she'd abandoned her own. You're right, she said, sitting up straighter. Time to get back to what I love. Maybe in August we should take a week somewhere. Colorado, for example. That's my girl. Judith hugged her with a grin. She's coming back to life. That evening, when Dorothy returned home, she was surprised to find a big box at her door. Inside were her belongings still left at Dan's place, books, a makeup bag, her favorite sweater, a photo album. On top lay a note. Forgive me. I was blind and foolish. When you're ready to talk, call me. I've realized everything, and I won't let Mom interfere in our life anymore. I love you. Dan. Dorothy stared at the note for a long time, feeling a strange mix of emotions. A week ago, words like these would have made her heart race. She might even have believed them, given him a second chance. But now the words felt hollow, the promises unconvincing. I won't let Mom interfere anymore, she repeated in her mind. But the problem wasn't just that. The problem was that Dan had lied, had betrayed. Could he really change, or would he just learn to hide his true intentions better? She placed the note back in the box. Maybe someday she'd be ready to talk to him. But not now. Right now, she needed time to figure herself out, to return to the woman she'd been before him, independent, confident, knowing what she wanted from life. On Monday at work, Kathy kept her word and offered Dorothy the new project, launching a company branch in another city. It meant frequent business trips, lots of responsibility, but also big career opportunities. "You can handle it," Kathy said with certainty. "You've got the experience, the knowledge, the sense of responsibility. And a change of scenery will do you good." Dorothy accepted with enthusiasm. Work had always been more than just a paycheck, it was a way to realize herself. And now, with her personal life on pause, her career could be the anchor to keep her steady. The first trip was set for the following week. Dorothy threw herself into preparation, studying documents, making plans, meeting new partners. There was no room left for sad thoughts. The evening before her departure, she decided to tidy up the apartment. She'd be gone for 5 days. While clearing out the bedroom closet, she came across the box of Dan's things she had packed after the breakup. He'd never picked it up, though she'd sent him a message about it. "I should deliver it," she thought. "Or send it by courier. No point in keeping it here." Among Dan's things, she found a small box she'd never seen before. Inside was a ring. Simple, no stones, but very elegant. With it was a note, "For my Dorothy. On our wedding anniversary." So he had planned a gift for the future, for an anniversary that would never come. The discovery caught Dorothy off guard. Maybe not everything had been fake. Maybe, deep down, he had truly loved her, just never enough to stand up to his mother. She put the ring back in the box and firmly closed the lid. The past was the past. Now she needed to move forward, without looking back. The doorbell rang. Dorothy glanced at the clock in surprise. Nearly 10 at night. Who could it be? She went to the door. "Who is it?" "It's me, Dan," came the familiar voice. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." Dorothy froze, unsure. She hadn't expected this visit, wasn't ready for it. But maybe it was time to put the final period, to never return to this again. "All right," she said, opening the door. "Come in." Dan looked worn out. Dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, hair disheveled. Nothing like the well-groomed, polished man she used to know. "Thanks for letting me in," he muttered awkwardly, shifting in the hallway. "I know I have no right to ask, but—" "Come to the kitchen," Dorothy cut him off. "I'll make tea." They sat across from each other like strangers. Dan turned the cup in his hands, hesitant to begin. At last, he looked up. "I cut ties with Mom." Dorothy raised her eyebrows in surprise. "What do you mean, cut ties?" "She's your mother." "I mean," he faltered, searching for words. "I told her I won't let her interfere in my life anymore. That I'm an adult and I'll make my own decisions." "And how did she take it?" Dorothy asked skeptically. Dan gave a weary smile. "What do you think? First hysterics, then tears, then accusations of being ungrateful. The usual. But I stood firm. I told her I love her, but I won't let her manipulate me anymore." Dorothy listened in silence, unsure whether to believe him. Could losing his fiancée really have pushed him to finally grow up and claim his independence? "I rented an apartment," Dan went on. "Not far, just in the next neighborhood. I want to start fresh." "Why are you telling me this?" Dorothy asked plainly. Dan met her gaze. "Because I still love you. And I hope one day you'll forgive me." Dorothy sighed. Part of her wanted to believe, to give him a second chance. But the other part, the sharper, colder part, reminded her of the betrayal, the lies, the way he had let his mother pull his strings. "Dan, I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time. I'm only just beginning to recover from all this. I'm not sure I'm ready to risk it again." He nodded, accepting her words. "I understand. And I'll wait as long as it takes. Just know, I've changed." What happened between us opened my eyes. I realized how much I lost because of my weakness. Dorothy walked him to the door. At the threshold, he turned. By the way, I spoke with the city hall staff. We can get a refund for the ceremony or reschedule it for another date. It's up to you. Dorothy smiled faintly. Let's not rush, all right? After he left, she sat in the kitchen for a long time, trying to untangle her feelings. Did she believe in his change? Could she trust him again? Or was it wiser to leave things as they were and move on alone? She had no answers yet. But one thing she knew for sure, never again would she let anyone decide how she should live. Not if they claimed to love her. Especially not if they claimed to love her. The business trip turned out to be exactly what she needed, 5 days in a new city, surrounded by strangers, completely immersed in work. It helped her step away from her personal turmoil and see things more clearly. To her surprise, she found she missed Dan less than she thought she would. Maybe the breakup really was for the best. When she came home, Dorothy found a postcard in her mailbox. An old-fashioned one, with a picture of a rose bouquet, the kind they didn't print anymore. Inside, in Dan's familiar handwriting, I hope your trip went well. I thought of you every day. If you want to talk, call me. Dan. Dorothy turned the postcard in her hands thoughtfully. He had given her one just like it on their very first date, from an antique shop, knowing her love of vintage things. Back then, it had seemed so romantic. Now, it stirred mixed feelings. She put the postcard away in her desk, with other keepsakes from their relationship, and went back to unpacking. Life went on, and she had to keep moving forward. The next weeks flew by in a blur of work and new experiences. It was as if Dorothy was making up for lost time, throwing herself into everything she had once given up for Dan: trips to the theater, evenings with friends, weekends out of town. Judith was thrilled by the change. You've blossomed. And you look younger, too. Dorothy noticed it herself. She smiled more, dressed more freely, played with her hair more often. It felt as though invisible chains that had bound her for years had finally fallen away. One evening, coming home from work, Dorothy found Virginia standing outside the building with a bag in her hands, looking uneasy, as if she couldn't bring herself to go in. Good evening, Virginia, Dorothy said calmly, though her heart beat faster. Visiting a neighbor? No, you, Dorothy. I wanted to talk. Dorothy raised her brows in surprise. What could this woman want from her now, after everything that had happened? All right, come in, she said, opening the door. We'll go up to my place. In the apartment, Virginia sat gingerly on the edge of the couch, nervously twisting a handkerchief. She looked older, more worn down. Tea? Coffee? Dorothy asked, keeping to courtesy. No, thank you, Virginia said quickly. I won't stay long. I came to apologize. Dorothy sat down across from her, unable to hide her surprise. Apologize? Yes. Virginia lowered her eyes. For everything I said that night. For our plans about your apartment. It was wrong. Dorothy stayed quiet, not sure how to respond. An apology was the last thing she had expected from this domineering woman. You see, Virginia went on after a pause, all my life I've been afraid of poverty. After Dan's father died, things were so hard. I worked 3 jobs, barely kept food on the table. I swore to myself then that I'd never be in need again. That I'd do everything to make sure my son and I always had a roof and bread to eat. Dorothy nodded slowly. She knew this story. Dan had told it 100 times. I understand your fears, Virginia, she said gently. But that doesn't excuse lies and manipulation. I know. Virginia sighed heavily. I went too far. It's just that when Dan said he was marrying a woman who owned an apartment in the center, I saw an opportunity. A chance to finally leave my old flat behind and live decently. And I pushed him. Dorothy studied her, trying to judge her sincerity. Dan didn't want to deceive you, Virginia added. It was me who convinced him that this would be better for everyone. That you'd understand and accept our plan once you got used to the idea of living together. And you really believed that? Dorothy asked skeptically. That I'd agree to sell my apartment for the sake of expanding your country house? Virginia lowered her head. I didn't think it through that way. I only saw what I wanted. I used my son to get it. Dorothy stayed silent, unsure whether to believe Virginia's words. Maybe she truly regretted everything. Or maybe this was just another layer of manipulation, this time aimed at getting her son back into his old life. Why did you decide to apologize now? Dorothy asked directly. Virginia lifted her eyes, glistening with tears. Because I've lost my son. Dan told me he doesn't want to see me anymore. That I've been manipulating him his whole life, using his feelings. That because of me, he lost the woman he loved. Dorothy flinched. So Dan really had broken away from his mother, just as he told her. It hadn't been an empty promise. I didn't know, she whispered. He moved out of my apartment, rented a place of his own, Virginia went on. Said he'll help financially, but live separately. Said he's 38, and it's time to learn to stand on his own. There was such bitterness in her voice that Dorothy couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. For all her flaws, Virginia did love her son, even if it was a possessive, controlling kind of love. I'm sorry it turned out this way, Dorothy said. But maybe it's for the best. Dan really does need to live his own life. Virginia nodded sadly. You're probably right. I just don't know how to let go. I've grown too used to him always being there, always depending on me. She pulled a small bundle from her bag. Here. An apple pie, for you. Your favorite. Dorothy didn't bother correcting her that she'd never been especially fond of apple pie. She had just once eaten 2 slices in a row, and Virginia had decided it must be her favorite dish. Thank you, she said, taking the bundle. That's very kind of you. Virginia rose to leave. I'm not asking you to go back to Dan. Just think about him. He's suffering. I've never seen him so unhappy. Dorothy walked her to the door. At the threshold, Virginia turned back. And Dorothy, I really did want you as my daughter-in-law. Not because of the apartment, but because you're a good woman. Smart, independent. The kind of woman I wish I had been at your age. When the door closed, Dorothy stood in the hallway for a long time, mulling over the strange visit. Should she believe Virginia's remorse? Had Dan truly broken with his past? And most of all, what should she do now? That evening, Judith called. Hey, how are you? Busy? Not really, Dorothy said. Just watching an old movie. Why? You won't believe who I ran into today. Judith's voice crackled with excitement. Dan. Dorothy tensed. And, she asked, forcing her voice to sound calm. He was with some woman. Young, 25 at most. They were sitting in a cafe, holding hands. Something inside Dorothy snapped. She thought she'd already gotten past the pain of losing him, but the idea of Dan with someone else cut deeper than she expected. Are you sure it was him? She asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Absolutely, Judith said firmly. I even went over to say hi. He looked flustered, introduced her as a co-worker. But I saw the way they looked at each other. That wasn't just colleagues. Dorothy closed her eyes, fighting a surge of jealousy. Why should it matter who he was with? They were done. He was free. And yet, it hurt. Thanks for telling me, she said shortly. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't have, Judith said, regret in her tone. I just thought it's better you hear it from me than stumble into them somewhere. No, you were right, Dorothy forced a casual tone. I'm glad he's moving on. I am too. But that night she couldn't sleep. The image of Dan with another woman burned in her mind, stirring a strange cocktail of pain, jealousy, and relief. Yes, maybe even relief. Because now she knew for certain it was over. No more doubts, no more wondering what if. In the morning, leaving for work, Dorothy was startled to find another bouquet at her door. wrapped in plain paper, left anonymously. Tucked into the flowers was a note, "Don't believe the rumors. I'm waiting only for you. Dan." Dorothy frowned. Somehow, he had found out about her talk with Judith and rushed to defend himself. But why? If he really was seeing someone else, that was his choice. They were no longer together. At work, she couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept circling back to Dan, his mother, their strange behavior. What did it all mean? Were they truly sorry? Or was this just another layer of manipulation? During lunch break, she called Judith. "Listen, are you absolutely sure about Dan and that girl? Could they really just be colleagues?" Judith paused before answering. "Honestly, I don't know. They were holding hands, yes. But maybe there's some other explanation. Want me to find out more?" "No," Dorothy said quickly. "Don't. It's none of my business." But her curiosity was already awake. All day she found herself wondering who the girl was. A friend? A new girlfriend? Or really just a coworker with whom he had a close bond? That evening Dorothy couldn't resist. She dialed Dan's number. He picked up almost instantly, as if he'd been waiting for her call. "Dorothy, is something wrong?" "No, she hesitated. "Your mom came to see me yesterday." "I know," Dan's voice tensed. "She told me." "I didn't ask her to, if that's what you're thinking." "I didn't think that," Dorothy said, taking a deep breath. "Judith saw you yesterday in a cafe. With some girl." Silence stretched at the other end of the line. Then Dan spoke quietly. "That's my cousin, Erin. My mom's sister's daughter. She came in from Chicago and asked me to help her look for a job." Dorothy felt her face flush. How embarrassing. She'd been jealous of Dan's own cousin. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," Dan cut in gently. "I'm glad you called. And that you were jealous." Dorothy wanted to object, to say she wasn't jealous at all, just healthily curious. But that would have been a lie. "I don't know what's happening to me," she admitted. "I thought I was over our breakup, moving on. And then I heard you were seeing someone, and..." "And what?" Dan asked quietly. "And I realized I still feel something for you," Dorothy finished. "Though I'm not sure it's love. Maybe it's just habit, dependence." Dan sighed. "I get it. These weeks without you were hard on me too. I've rethought a lot. I realized how much my mom influenced me, how I let her run my life. It was humiliating." Dorothy listened without interrupting. For the first time, Dan was speaking so openly, without excuses or deflection. "I really have changed," he went on. "I rented an apartment and told my mother I won't let her interfere in my life anymore." It was hard, seeing her tears, hearing the accusations. But I knew I had to do it. Not only for you, but for myself. "And how are you now?" Dorothy asked. Strange, he gave a wry smile. "On one hand, it's tough. I'm used to my mom always being there to tell me what to do, to help. On the other hand, I feel freer. Like I dropped a heavy backpack I'd been hauling my whole life." Dorothy smiled, recognizing her own thoughts after their breakup. "Maybe we could meet?" Dan suggested. "Just have some tea, talk." Dorothy hesitated. Was she ready for that? Would it be a step back into the past she'd worked so hard to leave? "All right," she said at last. "Let's meet. But only as friends, no strings attached." Of course, relief in Dan's voice. "When's good for you?" They agreed to meet on Saturday at a small cafe on the riverfront, a neutral place with no shared memories. After hanging up, Dorothy went to the window. The evening city glittered with lights, people hurried about their business, life went on. And her life was moving on too, taking unexpected turns. She didn't know where this meeting with Dan would lead. Maybe they'd simply put a period on everything and part for good. Or maybe they'd get a chance to start over, this time without lies or manipulation, on equal terms. One thing Dorothy knew for sure, she would never trust blindly again. She'd match words with deeds, promises with actions. And under no circumstances would she let anyone decide for her how to live or whom to build a future with. After all, that was why she had arrived at City Hall an hour early, to give fate a chance to show her the truth so she could make the right choice. And she hadn't missed that chance. On Saturday, Dorothy woke early, though she usually slept in on weekends. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, promising a warm summer day. The upcoming meeting with Dan stirred mixed feelings: excitement, curiosity, a twinge of anxiety. What would she say? What would they talk about after all that had happened? Dorothy got up and went to the closet, wondering what to wear. Back when they were together, she always chose her outfit carefully, elegant but not provocative, exactly how Dan liked it. Today she decided to dress for herself. She picked a bright summer dress with bare shoulders that had been hanging unworn for ages. Dan had thought it too revealing. New life, new rules, she told her reflection, touching up her lips with her favorite terracotta lipstick. The cafe on the embankment turned out to be a cozy spot with a river view. Dorothy arrived a little early and chose a table on the terrace. She ordered a cappuccino and watched people go by, families with kids, elderly couples holding hands, teens on rollerblades and scooters. Everyone was out to savor the fine summer day. Lost in her observations, she didn't notice Dan right away. He stood a few meters from the terrace, looking at her with a new expression, not the usual patronizing tenderness, but respect, almost admiration. "Hi," he said, coming up to the table. "You look wonderful." "Thanks," Dorothy smiled, noting that Dan had changed too. He'd slimmed down, grown a bit of stubble, swapped his usual crisp shirts for a more relaxed look, t-shirt and jeans. "You look good too." "Different." Dan sat across from her and ordered an espresso. "Yeah, a lot has changed," he said, gazing at the river. "I never thought at 38 I'd be learning how to live on my own from scratch, doing my laundry, cooking, paying the rent." Dorothy raised her eyebrows. "You never did that before?" "Not really," Dan admitted. "When I lived with Mom, she did everything. She'd say a man should earn money, not waste time on housework." Dorothy remembered their weekends together, how Dan never helped with cooking or cleaning. She'd taken it then as his traditional view of family roles. Now she saw it was just habit, formed by years of his mother's care. "And how's the new life treating you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Strange," Dan smiled. "At first it was awful. I nearly poisoned myself with my first solo omelet. Mixed up the laundry detergents and ruined a white shirt. But now I like it. There's something liberating about being responsible only for yourself." Dorothy nodded in understanding. She'd always valued her independence, the ability to handle life on her own. "How's your mom?" she asked carefully. "Are you two speaking?" "I call once a week, sometimes stop by. But I try to keep some distance. She still tries to control. She even showed up at my new place unannounced with a pot of soup and freshly laundered shirts." Dorothy couldn't help smiling at the picture. "And what did you do?" "I thanked her for the care but told her I need my own space," Dan said, surprised at his own resolve. "You know, I never used to dare tell her no, I was afraid of upsetting her. Now I see it wasn't fear of hurting her, it was fear of losing her approval, her love. As if I were still that 10-year-old boy who'd lost his father and was afraid of losing his mother too." Dorothy listened closely, surprised by the depth of Dan's self-reflection. He had never spoken so openly about his feelings or the reasons behind his actions before. "You've changed," she said. "For the better." "I hope so." He looked her straight in the eye. "What happened between us, it was like a cold shower. A wake-up call. I realized I lost you because of my weakness, because I couldn't stand up to my mother's pressure. And that it hurt. But I needed that pain." Dorothy took a sip of her now cold coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I'm glad this pushed you to grow. Really, I am. But don't think I broke up with you only because of your mother. The problem was you, your willingness to lie to me, to hide your real intentions." Dan lowered his head. I know. And there's no excuse. I really was planning to tell you about Mom's idea after the wedding. I thought once we were husband and wife, you'd agree, out of love for me. So you were planning to corner me when I couldn't back out anymore? Dorothy asked directly. Yes, he admitted quietly. And now I see just how low that was. Dorothy noted his honesty. Before, he would have come up with excuses, tried to justify himself. Now he openly admitted his guilt. You know, she said after a pause, I've realized a lot too. About myself, about you, about us. I realized I gave up too much of myself too quickly, my interests, my habits, for our relationship. I stopped going camping because you didn't like it. I stopped seeing some friends because you thought they were too loud. I even changed the way I dressed, choosing more conservative clothes. Dan looked at her in surprise. I never noticed. I thought you just shared my tastes. No, Dorothy shook her head. I was adapting to you. And the strangest part is, I didn't even realize it until we broke up. Only then did I see how much I'd changed myself for you. I'm sorry, Dan said sincerely. I never wanted you to give up the things you love. I know, Dorothy answered softly. It wasn't your fault, it was mine. I made that choice. Maybe because I was too afraid of being alone, too afraid of losing what looked like a perfect relationship. They fell silent, watching a small yacht drift along the river. A light breeze played with Dorothy's hair, and she absent-mindedly tucked a strand behind her ear, the little gesture Dan had always found charming. So what now? He asked. Can we start over? Dorothy hesitated. Part of her wanted to say yes. Despite everything, she still felt something for him. But another part, the more rational one, reminded her of the betrayal, the lies, the way he had let his mother pull the strings so easily. I don't know, she said honestly. I need time. I'm just beginning to rediscover myself, going back to the things I love. And I like this freedom, this independence. I understand, Dan nodded. I won't pressure you. Just know that I've changed. And if you ever decide to give us a second chance, I'll prove I deserve your trust. Dorothy smiled. Thanks for understanding. Let's just keep in touch. As friends. Get to know each other again. And then we'll see where it leads. Deal, Dan reached his hand across the table. Friends? Dorothy shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, they were talking with complete honesty, without hidden agendas. After the cafe, they strolled along the river, chatting about everything, work, books, plans for the future. Dan said he was thinking about changing jobs, looking for something more creative, less routine. Dorothy shared her impressions of the new project she was leading. When it came time to say goodbye, Dan didn't offer to walk her home like he once would have. See you next week? Maybe we could check out that new jazz club you mentioned? Dorothy raised her eyebrows. But you don't like jazz. I didn't, Dan admitted. But I figured it's time to broaden my horizons. Try something new. Dorothy smiled. Fine. Jazz club it is. Back home, she felt a calm she hadn't expected. The meeting with Dan didn't leave her with bitterness. On the contrary, it gave her the sense of closure she'd been craving. Whatever happened next, whether their relationship rekindled or not, at least now everything was out in the open. That evening Judith called. So? How did it go? Are you two back together? No, Dorothy replied. We decided to just stay in touch. As friends. No strings attached. Friends? Judith snorted skeptically. And you really believe that? Just friends after 3 years together? Dorothy thought for a moment. You know, I actually do. We've both changed. We see our mistakes more clearly now. Well, I hope so, Judith sighed. I just don't want you tangled up in this mess again. Virginia doesn't let go easily. I'll be careful, Dorothy promised. And besides, it's not just about his mother. It's about us, whether we can build something healthy, based on trust and respect. After hanging up, Dorothy stepped out onto the balcony. The summer evening was warm and quiet. Somewhere nearby, someone strummed a guitar. From open windows came voices, laughter, the clinking of dishes. Life was going on, untouched by one broken and perhaps rekindling love. Dorothy thought back to that day at City Hall when she had overheard Dan's conversation with his mother. At the time, it had felt like a catastrophe, the end of all her hopes. Now she understood it had been her salvation, from a marriage built on lies, from life with a man who hadn't respected her enough to be honest. Fate had given her a chance to learn the truth before it was too late. And though the path to that truth had been painful, it brought her to a better understanding of herself and of what she wanted. The following weeks took on a new rhythm. Dorothy and Dan really did spend time together as friends. They went to movies, to exhibitions, strolled around the city. He no longer tried to control her, didn't impose his opinions, didn't expect her to bend to his tastes. And she, step by step, learned how to trust him again, testing his words against his actions. At the end of July, Dorothy finally did something she had been afraid of for a long time. She invited Dan to go camping with her old friends. In the past, he had always refused, insisting such trips were too risky and uncomfortable. But now, to her surprise, he agreed without hesitation. "Are you sure?" she asked again. "It's going to be tents, campfires, no comforts." "Sure," Dan smiled. "I told you, I want to broaden my horizons. And besides, I want to see the side of you I never really knew, the Dorothy who loves adventures and the outdoors." The trip was planned for the weekend. Dorothy was nervous. How would Dan fit in with her friends? Would he be uncomfortable? Would he slip back into criticizing the things she loved? On Friday evening, just as she was finishing packing her backpack, Virginia called. "Dorothy, hello." Her former mother-in-law's voice sounded unusually cheerful. "How are you, dear? I heard you and Dan are seeing each other again." She went straight to the point. "That's wonderful. I always said you two were the perfect couple." Dorothy held back a smirk, remembering how recently this woman had tried to take away her home. "We're just friends, Virginia. We're trying to build something new without grudges or blame." Of course," Virginia said, her joy barely hidden. "I just wanted to tell you I fully support you. And if you decide to get back together, I'll be all for it. No pressure, no plans for your apartment. I promise." Dorothy wasn't sure whether to believe her. Had Virginia really changed, or was this just another mask to get what she wanted? "Thanks for understanding," she answered calmly. "But right now, Dan and I really are just friends. What happens next, I don't know." Virginia sighed. "Well, I understand. Time will tell. By the way, I baked a cherry pie. I know you love it. Maybe I could drop it off?" Dorothy rolled her eyes silently. Some habits clearly weren't easy to change. "Thanks, but I'm going camping with friends this weekend." "Camping?" Virginia sounded genuinely shocked. "Does Dan know?" "Of course," said Dorothy. "He's coming with us." There was stunned silence on the other end. "Dan? Camping? With tents and mosquitoes?" He always said that wasn't for him. That decent people vacation at resorts, in good hotels. "People change, Virginia," Dorothy said softly. "Sometimes for the better." After the call, Dorothy thought it over. Virginia's sudden interest was clearly her way of probing, to see how serious things were between her son and his ex-fiancée. Which meant Dan hadn't told her the details. That was a good sign. He was really learning to set boundaries and protect his own space. The next morning, Dan picked Dorothy up so they could head to the station together, where her friends were waiting. He looked different, in camping clothes, with a brand new backpack and hiking boots instead of his usual loafers. "So, ready for adventure?" Dorothy asked with a smile as she opened the door. "Ready," Dan nodded firmly. "I bought everything on your list. Even bug spray, though mosquitoes usually don't bite me." That's because you've always been a city guy, Dorothy laughed. You'll see, forest mosquitoes aren't as picky as the city ones. As they went down the stairs, she realized for the first time in a long while that she felt genuinely happy. Not because Dan was with her again, but because she had finally found balance between love and self-respect, between being with someone and keeping her independence. What lay ahead? Another attempt at building a family, or just a solid friendship? Dorothy didn't know. But she was sure of one thing: whatever happened, she would never lose herself again for the sake of a relationship. If Dan truly loved her, he'd accept her the way she was, with all her passions, dreams, and need for space. And if not, then they really weren't meant to be. Better to learn that now than after a wedding, when it would be so much harder to start over. The camping trip turned out to be a real test for Dan. The first day, he held up well, helping set up tents, building the fire, even volunteering to peel potatoes for dinner. But on the second day, it started raining, and Dorothy watched with curiosity to see how her ex, so used to comfort, would handle the hardships of camping life. To her surprise, Dan didn't complain. Soaked and shivering, he kept smiling, even cracking jokes while helping tie up a tarp over the fire. Dorothy's friends, who at first were skeptical about the city boy, as they called him, gradually warmed up to him and welcomed him into the group. "He's not bad, your ex," Dorothy's friend Dana whispered while they were gathering firewood. "Not nearly as much of a bore as you described." Dorothy smiled. "He's changed. Or maybe I just used to see only what I wanted to see in him." That evening, when the rain finally stopped and everyone gathered around the fire, someone pulled out a guitar. Old songs from their youth filled the night air. Dorothy was surprised to hear that Dan knew many of them, and even sang well. "I didn't know you liked these songs," she said when the two of them were left by the dying fire. The others had already gone to their tents. Dan stared thoughtfully into the flames. "My dad loved them. I remember when I was a kid, we'd go to the country house, and he'd sing by the fire at night. Mom disapproved, thought it was a waste of time. After he died, the guitar just stayed in the closet, and I kind of forgot about it." Dorothy stayed quiet, feeling a new, deeper connection forming between them. In the past, Dan had rarely spoken about his father, as if the topic were off limits. "You know," he went on, tossing another branch into the fire, "I think Mom tried to erase every memory of him. Maybe it hurt too much. Or maybe she was afraid I'd turn out just like him." "Like what?" Dorothy asked softly. "Free," Dan looked at her. "My dad was a very independent man. An artist by trade, a dreamer by nature. He loved my mom, but he never let her control his life. They argued about that a lot." Suddenly, things clicked for Dorothy. After losing her husband, Virginia had poured all her need for control into her son. And Dan, too afraid of hurting her, too afraid of causing her more pain, had given in and given up part of himself. "And now," she asked, "are you afraid of becoming like your father?" Dan thought for a moment. "No. On the contrary, I'd actually like to be more like him. Not in everything, of course. He was a wonderful man, but not the most responsible. He'd forget about bills, about everyday things, even my parent-teacher meetings. But he knew how to enjoy life, how to see beauty in simple things. That's what I've always been missing." Dorothy reached over and squeezed his hand. It's never too late to start changing. After the camping trip, they kept seeing each other. Not exactly as friends anymore, but more like two people rediscovering each other. Dorothy was surprised to find sides of Dan she had never noticed before, or that he had carefully hidden. His creative streak, his sense of humor, his ability to admit when he was wrong. And he seemed to see her in a new light too, not as a potential wife who had to fit certain standards, but as her own person, with her interests, dreams, and quirks. In August, Dorothy decided it was time for an important conversation. They were sitting on her balcony, enjoying the warm evening and a glass of wine. "I want to talk about us," she began. "About where we're heading." Dan looked at her attentively. "I'm listening." "I feel good with you," Dorothy said honestly. "Better than before." But I'm afraid we'll fall into the same patterns again. That you'll go back to old habits, and I'll start adjusting, losing myself. Dan turned his glass in his hand, thoughtful. I think about that too. And I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. All I can promise is that I'll try to be better, more honest. And that I'll never again put anyone's interests above yours. Not my mom's, not anyone's. Dorothy smiled. And I promise I won't stay silent anymore if something bothers me. I won't bend myself out of shape just to keep the peace. I'll learn to say no when I need to. Sounds like a good plan. Dan lifted his glass. To a new beginning? To a new beginning, Dorothy clinked hers against his. But let's not rush. Let's just live, get to know each other again, and see where it goes. Agreed, Dan nodded. No pressure, no expectations. Just us, and whatever comes of it. Fall brought changes. Dorothy's project was a success, and she was offered a promotion. Dan also made a big shift. He left the consulting firm where he'd worked for 10 years and joined a small creative studio. The pay was less, but he enjoyed it far more. They didn't move in together, preferring to keep their personal space. Sometimes they spent weekends at each other's places, sometimes apart. This freer style of relationship puzzled people around them. So are you two together or not? Judith pressed. Are you planning a wedding or what? As for marriage, we'll see. For now, we're happy as we are. Virginia also struggled to accept her son's new way of living. She kept trying to get her old influence back, calling late at night with complaints about her health, showing up unannounced with soup or pies. But Dan stood firm, polite, but clear about his boundaries. In October, nearly 6 months after the canceled wedding, Dorothy got an unexpected offer to spend 3 months in Boston managing the opening of a new branch. It was a great career opportunity, but it meant being away from Dan for a long stretch. I have to take it, she said when they discussed it. It's important to me, to my career. Dan looked at her thoughtfully. I know. And I'll support whatever you decide. Really? Dorothy searched his face for signs of disapproval or hidden manipulation. You won't be against it? I'll miss you, of course, Dan admitted. But it's just 3 months. And I can visit on weekends. I've always wanted to spend more time in Boston anyway. Warmth spread through Dorothy. In the past, Dan would have argued, tried to persuade her otherwise, maybe even sulked. Now, he simply accepted her choice and looked for ways to support her. Thank you, she hugged him. That means a lot. She left for Boston in early November. The gray, rainy city welcomed her with damp winds and fog, but she quickly fell in love with its atmosphere. Work took most of her time, but weekends belonged to her and Dan. He came, just as promised, and together they explored the city, visited museums, and lingered in cozy cafes. One weekend, while walking along the waterfront, Dan suddenly stopped and looked at her seriously. There's something I want to tell you. She raised her eyebrows. Did something happen? No, he smiled. I just realized something important. These months of living apart, only seeing you on weekends, they've shown me I can be happy even if you're not beside me every day. That I can take joy in your success instead of resenting your work. That I can respect your space, your independence. Dorothy felt a lump rise in her throat. And I've realized something too. That you can love someone without losing yourself. That being in a relationship doesn't mean giving yourself up, but gaining something new, on top of what you already have. Dan took her hands. Dorothy, I don't want to rush things, but I love you. And when you come back home, I want us to live together. Not in my place or yours, but in a new place that's ours. No past, no ghosts. Dorothy thought for a long moment. They had come a long way since that day at City Hall, when she had overheard that fateful conversation. They had both changed, stronger, more honest, wiser. But was she ready? Let's do this, she said finally. When I get back, let's just live together for a while. See how it works in real life, not just during romantic weekends. And then we'll decide if we want something more. That sounds reasonable, Dan agreed. No promises, no pressure. Just two grown people who love each other and want to be together. Dorothy returned home at the end of January. The Boston project was a success, and now a promotion awaited her, Deputy Director of Development. Dan met her at the airport with a bouquet of her favorite freesias and an invitation to see an apartment he had found for them. The place turned out to be bright and spacious, in a new building near the park. 2 separate offices, one for her, one for him, a big living room, a practical kitchen. No old memories, a blank page for a new story. Do you like it? Dan asked anxiously after they toured the rooms. I love it, Dorothy said sincerely. Especially the fact that it has space for each of us. A place to be alone when we need to. They moved in together in February, deciding not to rush into marriage. A stamp in the passport doesn't change anything, Dorothy said. What matters is what happens between us every day. When Virginia found out they were living together without getting married, she was skeptical at first. What do you mean, no wedding? What will people think? But Dan stood firm. Mom, this is our life and our decision. We'll do what feels right for us, not what the neighbors approve of. To Dorothy's surprise, his mother accepted it fairly quickly. Maybe she realized her son had truly changed and was no longer under her control. Or maybe she was just tired of fighting. Either way, their relationship gradually became healthier, without her old dominance, but also without complete estrangement. In spring, when the apple trees in the park near their home bloomed, Dan surprised Dorothy with a suggestion. Let's go to City Hall, the one where our wedding was supposed to happen. Dorothy looked at him in surprise. Why? Do you want to apply again? No, Dan smiled. I just want to close that chapter. To go back to where it all started and thank life for giving us a second chance. They went to City Hall on a sunny April afternoon. The building looked exactly the same as a year ago, when Dorothy had arrived in her wedding dress, full of hope and expectation. It's a strange feeling, she said as they stood by the entrance. Like it all happened in another life. It did, Dan took her hand. We were different people then. I was weak and dishonest, and you were ready to sacrifice yourself for the relationship. Dorothy nodded. And now? And now we're just two adults who love each other as we are. No masks, no games, no manipulations. They didn't go inside, just stood there for a while, then walked on into the nearby park. On a bench, Dan pulled a small box from his pocket. It's not an engagement ring, he said quickly when he saw Dorothy's surprise. Just a gift. For the anniversary of the conversation that changed our lives. Inside was a simple silver ring, engraved on the inside, "Be yourself. I love you as you are." Dorothy slipped the ring on her finger and hugged him tightly. Thank you. For finding the strength to change. For learning to respect my boundaries. For loving the real me. And thank you, he whispered. For not being afraid to walk away back then. For giving me a second chance later. For showing me that love isn't control or sacrifice, it's freedom and respect. They sat on the bench, holding hands, watching life unfold around them, young mothers with strollers, elderly couples, teenagers on skateboards. An ordinary spring day, full of simple joys. Dorothy thought about how strange life could be. A year ago, that overheard conversation had felt like a disaster, the end of all her hopes. But in reality, it was the start of a new path, one that was more honest, more conscious. Sometimes you have to lose what you think you have to see its true value. Sometimes you have to fall to learn how to rise. Sometimes you have to hear a bitter truth to finally live without illusions. What are you thinking about? Dan asked, noticing her distant look. Dorothy smiled. About how much one single conversation can change. Especially when it's unexpected. They stood up and walked further into the park, toward a future that belonged only to them, free of other people's expectations, free of imposed plans, free of hidden agendas. Just a man and a woman who had found the courage to be real, and to love each other for it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us every day to bring you new and captivating stories. You can already find our next story on the main screen. We wish you all the very best and lots of happiness in life.